A humble maid who had spent many years serving a wealthy and powerful family was suddenly accused of stealing a priceless heirloom. Without a lawyer by her side, she was dragged into court, humiliated in public, and left completely alone against the strength and influence of the Whitmores. Everyone believed she was guilty because, in the eyes of society, the word of the rich carried far more weight than her tears and her truth. But in the middle of the trial, when it seemed as though nothing in the world could save her, something happened no one could have predicted. The billionaire's own young son, who loved her as if she were his second mother, broke free from his nanny, rushed into the courtroom, and revealed a devastating secret that changed the entire case forever. Before we continue, remember to subscribe to the channel and give the video a like. And comment below where you are watching from. We always love to know. Sophia Miller had worked for the Whitmore family for many years. Each day she swept the long marble halls of the sprawling estate, polished the antique furniture, prepared meals with care, and made certain that every room was as spotless as the day before. She was quiet, respectful, and deeply trusted by nearly everyone in the house. Over the years she had become close to little James, the young son of Richard Whitmore. James adored Sophia and saw her as more than a servant. To him, she was a second mother. Richard Whitmore, James's father, was a stern man who had been widowed several years earlier. He had been raised under the watchful eye of his own mother, Eleanor, a cold, exacting woman who liked to control every detail of the household. Eleanor had never truly approved of Sophia, though she rarely said so directly. One day, the family's most valuable jewel, a diamond pendant passed down for generations, suddenly went missing. Eleanor immediately placed the blame on Sophia. She insisted that Sophia was the only outsider in the house, and therefore it had to be her. Sophia stood stunned and heartbroken by the accusation. Eleanor refused to wait for an investigation. She went straight to Richard and told him without hesitation that Sophia must have stolen the jewel. Eleanor pointed out that Sophia was poor, and that perhaps desperation had driven her to steal. Richard, though uncertain, trusted his mother's judgment. Eleanor was persuasive, and her word carried heavy influence. Sophia pleaded with them, insisting she would never do such a thing. She begged them to search again, to consider that the pendant might have been misplaced. But Eleanor would not hear it. Richard, torn but unable to resist his mother's pressure, gave in. He told Sophia she would have to leave the estate. Her heart shattered. After everything she had given this family, after years of loyalty and sacrifice, they now saw her as nothing but a thief. The police were called. Neighbors watched in silence as Sophia was escorted away from the grand Whitmore estate, her head lowered in tears. Her only crime had been honest work for a family that suddenly turned against her. At the local police station, Sophia sat silently while officers questioned her. They did not place her under arrest, but they treated her with suspicion. She had no lawyer, no money, and no one to stand beside her. Her world seemed to collapse around her. She was eventually allowed to go home, but not before being told she would need to appear in court. News of the accusation spread quickly. Whispers filled the streets. Neighbors turned cold, and Sophia's name became tied to theft, though she had never stolen a thing in her life. She returned to her tiny home and wept for hours, grieving the life she had lost in a single day. The worst part was not the court summons, nor even the humiliation of being accused. It was losing James. She missed his warm smile, his endless questions, and the way he threw his little arms around her neck. She had raised him like her own child, and now she did not know if she would ever see him again. Days later, an official letter arrived from the courthouse. Sophia was being formally accused of stealing the pendant and would stand trial. She had never set foot inside a courtroom before. She did not understand the law, she did not have the means to hire an attorney, and she felt utterly powerless. She reached out to acquaintances, but no one would help. People feared the Whitmores too much. They were wealthy, well-connected, and able to influence anyone. Sophia walked the streets with her head down, ashamed. At night she lay awake replaying every detail in her mind. The pendant, the coldness in Richard's eyes, the silence of those around her. Each moment pressed on her chest like a stone. She could not understand how a lifetime of devotion had left her abandoned, alone in a storm she did not create. And yet, a small light of hope appeared. A few days after the accusation, there was a knock at her door. It was James. The little boy had slipped away from the estate to see her. He hugged her tightly and began to cry. He told her he didn't believe what his grandmother said, that he missed her terribly, and that the house felt empty without her. Sophia held him and wept. She hadn't dared hope she would see him again. James handed her a drawing he had made, a simple picture of himself holding Sophia's hand. That innocent gesture gave her strength she thought she had lost. Even though she had been cast out, branded a thief, and left without dignity, she still had James's love. He was too young to fight for her in court, but his loyalty reminded her that not everyone had turned their back. It was enough to give her courage to go on. The day of her trial was approaching. Sophia knew she had to find some way to defend herself. She gathered whatever she could, old letters of recommendation, photographs, testimonies from families she had served before the Whitmores. She visited a legal aid center downtown, hoping someone might take pity. A young intern listened and promised to do what he could, though he was inexperienced. Sophia handed him every detail she remembered. It was not much, but it was something. She did not know if it would save her. But she resolved that when she stood in court, she would not stand merely as a servant. They would see her as a woman unwilling to be crushed by injustice. Meanwhile, the Whitmores were already preparing for victory. Eleanor wasted no time. She hired Charles Bennett, one of the most feared attorneys in the city, known for never losing a case involving the rich. She instructed him to make certain Sophia would be branded guilty in front of the entire community. Headlines soon appeared. Maid steals from Whitmore family. Sophia's name was destroyed before she ever stood trial. Richard Whitmore noticed how quickly everything was unfolding. He saw how his mother handled the case with ruthless precision, and while he didn't agree with every decision, he remained silent. Deep inside, an unease stirred. He remembered how Sophia had cared for James, how she arrived early each morning, worked tirelessly, and never gave them cause for doubt. But his loyalty to Eleanor, the woman who raised him, weighed heavily. She had always told him what was best for the family, and Richard had always obeyed. He tried to push the guilt aside. He buried himself in work, avoiding the storm of reporters and speculation. Yet whenever he passed the empty servants' quarters where Sophia had once lived, the memories pierced him. He did not speak to Charles Bennett, nor did he attempt to slow the press attacks. He stood suspended between respect for his mother and quiet guilt over Sophia's fate, and still he chose silence. Meanwhile, young James felt the absence of Sophia like a wound. His world no longer felt safe or warm. The laughter that once filled his room had vanished, replaced by whispers and tension. He asked his father again and again where Sophia had gone, but Richard's answers were vague, evasive. Eleanor, more direct, told the boy not to worry, that Sophia had done something terrible and would never return. James did not believe it. He remembered the songs she sang to soothe him, the way she helped with his schoolwork, the small cakes she baked just for him. Nights were the hardest. He missed her stories at bedtime, her gentle smile that made the darkness less frightening. The new staff didn't know how to care for him the way she did. Feeling alone, James drew a picture of himself and Sophia, another image of them hand in hand. He hid it away in a drawer, clinging to hope that one day she would return. While Eleanor orchestrated a flawless victory, the true investigation lay neglected. Sophia struggled to gather what she could to prove her innocence. She returned to the estate with a neighbor, hoping to find answers. She recalled the security cameras near the jewel room. But when she asked about the footage, no one provided a clear response. Finally, she learned the most unsettling fact of all. The camera that should have recorded the pendant's disappearance had been switched off at the exact moment it went missing. The discovery unsettled her deeply. Why would a camera fail at that precise hour? She shared the detail with a court officer, but he dismissed it as irrelevant, without evidence of who turned it off. Sophia felt the familiar sting of helplessness. She was no lawyer. She lacked the knowledge to argue or the power to demand answers. Yet the inconsistency gnawed at her. Back at the estate, Eleanor drove the case forward with unrelenting force. She pressed to move the trial date up, eager for a swift victory. Charles Bennet followed every instruction, crafting statements that painted Sophia as an opportunist who had always been suspect. Eleanor whispered to journalists, hinting that Sophia had a history of money troubles, debts, perhaps even past thefts. None of it was true, but newspapers ran the stories anyway. Sophia watched her reputation dissolve day by day. Neighbors who once greeted her turned away. Former friends stopped returning her calls. She felt abandoned, the world closing in. Even before stepping into the courtroom, it seemed judgment had already been passed. At night she whispered to herself, reminding her heart she was innocent. But the more the world shouted thief, the more powerless she felt. As the trial neared, she could barely sleep. The headlines still called her a criminal. Her court-appointed lawyer barely spoke with her, treating the case like one more file on a crowded desk. Eleanor, meanwhile, made certain the courtroom would be filled with reporters and respected names from society. She wanted a spectacle, a stage where Sophia would be crushed publicly. Richard kept his silence. He told himself it was too late to undo what had begun. He watched from the shadows as his mother arranged every detail. James, too, said nothing. But each night he lay awake, thinking of Sophia. The Whitmores seemed to have already secured victory. Yet inside Sophia, a stubborn flame burned. She resolved to stand, no matter how impossible the odds. The morning of the trial arrived. Sophia dressed in her old maid's uniform, the only presentable clothing she owned. Her hands trembled, but she straightened her back. She walked into the courthouse, whispers trailing her. Some looked at her with pity, others with disdain. She sat alone, clutching a worn satchel filled with documents. Her eyes were red from sleepless nights, yet she refused to cry. The judge entered, and the trial began. On the opposing side, the prosecutor rose, hired by Eleanor, loyal to her command. He wasted no time branding Sophia an opportunist, a servant who grew too comfortable in the Whitmore household and thought she could take what was not hers. Sophia sat in silence. His words struck like arrows. Ungrateful, calculated, false loyalty. The courtroom listened with rapt attention, many nodding as if his story was truth. He displayed photographs of the missing pendant, reciting its value. He emphasized how Sophia had access to the rooms, painting her as the only possible thief. Witnesses came forward, former staff, acquaintances of the family, each one bolstering the Whitmore side. Some bent their words, shifting their memories to suit the story. Truth seemed irrelevant. Richard sat beside his mother, arms folded, gaze fixed on the floor. He did not look at Sophia. Memories of her kindness, her endless care for James flickered in his mind. Yet his mother's insistence that justice must be done echoed louder. He felt paralyzed, trapped between conscience and loyalty. Each time Sophia glanced toward him, hoping for a flicker of support, he looked away. Eleanor, meanwhile, sat with confidence. She leaned toward Charles Bennet with a whisper, smirked when the prosecution hit its mark, and carried herself as though the outcome were already sealed. For her, the trial was not about truth, it was about dominance. In the back row, James sat with Mrs. Green, his nanny. He wasn't supposed to be there, but he had insisted. Quietly he watched the courtroom drama unfold. He didn't understand every word, but he understood enough. Sophia, the woman who once comforted him when storms frightened him, was now the one accused. No one asked the child what he thought. No one wanted to hear him, but James sat still, his eyes fixed on Sophia, silently wishing he could reach her. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed. Headlines had already damned her. Maid betrays Whitmore's. Servant caught stealing. No one waited for evidence. Sophia was already guilty in the court of public opinion. On social media and radio shows, strangers hurled judgment. Some called her greedy. Others claimed she had planned the theft long ago. Sophia had no voice to answer back. Her image was plastered across screens, her name trending for all the wrong reasons. She felt erased as a person, reduced to a single word, thief. Yet even as shame and despair pressed in, she lifted her chin. She remembered her mother's words about holding dignity no matter the storm. When it came time for Sophia to speak, the courtroom fell into silence. She rose, walked to the stand, and steadied herself. Her hands were icy but did not shake. She looked directly at the judge, then straight ahead, and began. She spoke of loyalty, of years spent serving with devotion. She spoke of James, whom she loved as her own child. She swore she had never stolen, never even considered it. Her voice broke once, but she did not cry. She spoke plainly from the heart. She admitted she knew the court had already judged her, but she needed to tell the truth regardless. When she finished, the silence was heavy. Faces in the crowd remained cold, indifferent. No applause, no sympathy, only the weight of doubt. She sat again, as alone as before. As the trial pressed on, cracks began to appear in the carefully crafted story. At first, everything moved according to Eleanor Whitmore's design, but little by little, inconsistencies crept into the case. Some household staff who might have testified were suddenly unavailable, their absences unexplained. The long-time housekeeper, Mrs. Thompson, who had worked at the Whitmore estate longer than anyone, was abruptly dismissed. When Sophia's court-appointed lawyer attempted to reach her for a statement, Mrs. Thompson refused to comment. Fear seemed to hang over the entire household. Whispers circulated quietly among the younger maids. One confided that she had seen Eleanor near the jewelry room late at night, just before the pendant disappeared. But when asked to repeat the story publicly, she quickly recanted, saying she could not risk her position. Fear was stronger than truth. Sophia listened to these fragments and felt her confusion deepen. Something did not add up, yet she lacked the tools or support to investigate. Meanwhile, inside the Whitmore mansion, young James grew restless. Though still a child, he noticed the peculiar way adults around him whispered and hushed their conversations whenever he approached. He remembered something from the night the pendant vanished. He had awoken for water and glimpsed movement near the jewelry room. He thought he saw his grandmother, but the next morning when he mentioned it, Eleanor dismissed him sharply. She told him it had only been a dream and instructed him never to speak of it again. At the time he had believed her, but now, watching Sophia stand trial, he wasn't sure anymore. James tried to share his memory with his father. He waited for the right moment, but Richard seemed distracted, weighed down by the case and unwilling to listen. James felt invisible, his voice swallowed by the storm. Eleanor noticed the boy's unease. She began to smother him with attention, lavish gifts, sweets, promises of a trip to the amusement park. She hugged him often and assured him he was special, but behind her displays of affection lay calculation. She feared James might speak up, so she worked to keep him distracted and silenced. When James mentioned again that he remembered something from that night, Eleanor smiled, pretending to believe him, but warned him not to say anything. She told him people might become confused and even blame him. Frightened, James buried his thoughts, though they gnawed at him silently. Sophia, on the other hand, was unraveling. The trial seemed hopeless. Each day she walked into the courthouse wearing the same faded uniform, met by stares that branded her guilty. Her court-appointed defender barely acknowledged her. She sat through proceedings feeling smaller, as though her words had no weight. Then, one evening, as she returned home, weary and broken, there was a knock on her door. A young woman stood outside, holding a folder close to her chest. She introduced herself as Anna Carter, a new lawyer just starting her career. She explained she had been following the case in the papers and felt something was wrong. Anna admitted she had little experience, but her eyes were earnest. She believed Sophia was telling the truth. For weeks, no one had believed Sophia. To hear a stranger say those words made her chest tighten with relief. Anna asked if she could represent her officially. At first, Sophia hesitated. What hope could a young lawyer with no history bring? But quickly she agreed. She had nothing left to lose and desperately needed someone willing to fight. Anna immediately set to work. She stayed late into the night, poring over transcripts, reviewing newspaper reports, and writing down every detail Sophia shared. She noted how inconsistent many statements were, and she found it suspicious that the malfunctioning camera had been so easily ignored. Sophia told her about the maid who claimed to see Eleanor in the jewelry room that night. Though the girl had retracted her words, Anna recognized its significance. She began a list of people to interview and filed the paperwork to officially replace the court-appointed lawyer. The judge approved the request, but warned Anna the case was complicated and dangerous. Anna did not back down. She believed in giving Sophia a voice, and her resolve strengthened Sophia's spirit. For the first time in weeks, Sophia felt she was not completely alone. While Anna prepared her case, the Whitmore estate remained cloaked in tension. The staff spoke less and less, avoiding even glances with one another. Eleanor maintained her composure, always smiling, always in control, but her eyes lingered watchfully on James. Richard kept his distance, speaking little, struggling with his own doubts. James continued to think about the night the pendant disappeared. The image of his grandmother moving in the hallway refused to leave him. Each time he saw Sophia in court, his heart grew heavier. He wanted to help her, but Eleanor's warnings rang in his ears. He was only a child, and he did not want to be sent away. Eleanor noticed his quiet defiance and redoubled her efforts to keep him under her sway. More gifts, more reassurances, more honeyed words meant to hide the shadows beneath. She feared him more than anyone, for children have a way of telling truths adults prefer to bury. Anna continued her careful work. She combed through courthouse archives, pulling every document tied to the supposed theft. She noticed glaring discrepancies, times that did not match, officer reports that seemed incomplete, details about the broken camera brushed aside. It looked less like an investigation and more like a cover-up. She compared these records with Sophia's meticulous recollections. Sophia remembered exactly where she had been, what time she cleaned certain rooms, and who had passed through the corridors. Yet the official reports ignored many of these details. The pieces refused to align. Anna realized this case was not about a simple theft. Something deeper lurked beneath. She resolved to visit the Whitmore estate herself, determined to look for the answers missing from the files. Back at the mansion, James's restlessness grew. One afternoon, while Eleanor read in the parlor, he gathered his courage. He asked her outright about the night the pendant vanished. He told her he remembered seeing her near the jewelry room and wanted to know if Sophia was truly guilty. Eleanor's eyes turned cold. She set down her book and warned him to stop asking questions. Adults had already solved the matter, she said, and children must not meddle. But James pressed again, repeating what he had seen. Eleanor's expression hardened. She leaned forward and told him that if he continued, she would send him to boarding school far away. James froze. The thought of leaving his father terrified him. Eleanor repeated the threat softly, and the boy fell silent, though fear now lived heavy in his heart. Richard, meanwhile, began to feel the pressure from outside. Journalists hounded him. Whispers spread that the Whitmores were hiding something. The trial had become a spectacle, and he could no longer ignore the attention. One night, alone in his office, Richard opened old video recordings stored on his computer. He wasn't seeking evidence about the pendant. He only wanted comfort. He stumbled upon a recording of Sophia sitting with James after his wife's death. She held the crying child close, whispering that he was loved and safe. Watching it, Richard felt his heart stir. He realized she had been more than a servant. She had been family, For the first time, doubt pierced his certainty. Perhaps Sophia was not guilty. Perhaps he had been blind. Meanwhile, Anna uncovered a startling lead. She tracked down a guest from a charity gala held shortly after the pendant supposedly vanished. The woman told her she had seen Eleanor at the event wearing the very same jewel. Anna's pulse quickened. If true, it meant the pendant had never been stolen at all. She searched for proof and found a single photograph online. Eleanor in a dark dress, the pendant glittering around her neck. Anna saved it immediately, but by the next day the picture had vanished. The website had removed it. The source refused to talk. Evidence had been erased, as if by unseen hands. Anna's frustration burned, but so did her determination. She returned to Sophia with the story, explaining that the disappearance of the photo only confirmed Eleanor's influence reached far and wide. Sophia was not surprised. She had long suspected Eleanor's hand in the matter. Now she felt more certain than ever. Anna promised to keep searching, convinced that the truth was within reach, though Eleanor's shadow loomed over every step. Inside the Whitmore household, Eleanor began to sense pressure closing in. She noticed Richard's silences were heavier than before, and James's quiet eyes seemed to hold unspoken questions. She could feel Anna Carter working in the background, her persistence unsettling. Eleanor had spent her life perfecting control, but for the first time, cracks were beginning to show. She responded by tightening her grip. She warned the household staff not to speak to anyone outside, her words sharp and absolute. She kept James close, showering him with gifts, treats, and distractions. Yet behind the toys and sweets, his eyes betrayed doubt. With Richard, she leaned on guilt. She reminded him constantly of the Whitmore name, of legacy, of the duty he owed to his late father. Her determination hardened. She had built her life on reputation and power, and she would not allow a servant to destroy it. But even Eleanor, with her icy poise, could feel the circle narrowing. If she wanted to preserve herself, she would need to act boldly, perhaps even ruthlessly. On the third day of the trial, the atmosphere in the courthouse was tense. The judge sat with watchful eyes, attorneys shuffled papers, and Sophia tried to steady her breath. She looked worn but resolute, her hands clasped in her lap. Beside her, Anna leaned close, whispering encouragement. "Stay strong. Do not lose hope." Across the aisle, the Whitmores took their usual seats. Eleanor radiated confidence, every inch the matriarch in command. Richard sat beside her, his face carefully unreadable. The prosecution continued its assault, painting Sophia as manipulative and untrustworthy. Every detail was spun to suggest she had taken advantage of the family's kindness. And then, in the midst of the monotony of accusations, the courtroom doors swung open. A small figure slipped inside. James had escaped from Mrs. Green, who struggled behind him. Heads turned as the boy ran past rows of astonished onlookers. He rushed straight to Sophia and wrapped his arms around her waist, clinging to her as though to shield her from harm. The room froze. Then, in a voice that trembled but rang with urgency, James pressed his hand over Sophia's mouth and blurted, "Shh, I know who did this, Mommy." Chaos erupted. Journalists leapt from their seats, cameras flashing. People gasped, whispering furiously. The judge hammered for order, but the room buzzed with disbelief. Sophia stood paralyzed, clutching James, her heart racing. Eleanor's face went pale, the color draining as though her composure had cracked in an instant. Richard leapt to his feet. The judge demanded the boy be removed, but Richard stepped forward, his voice unsteady yet determined. He insisted his son be allowed to speak. For weeks James had been quiet, holding something in, and now he needed to be heard. After a tense pause, the judge agreed. The room grew hushed. James stood small and frightened, but he gathered courage. He told them how one night, when he rose for water, he saw his grandmother Eleanor in the office. He saw her holding something that glimmered in the dim light and tucking it inside a wooden box with a golden lock. He remembered her whispering, "Sophia will be an easy target." The words struck like thunder. The prosecutor tried to seize control, his voice rising. He insisted James was only a child, prone to confusion, likely mistaking dreams for reality. Children, he argued, were unreliable witnesses. Memories could not be trusted. Eleanor leaned back in her chair, her face carefully composed, but her fingers drummed nervously against the armrest. James, however, did not waver. He described the wooden box in detail, the dark wood, the golden clasp, the desk drawer where it was hidden. His words were too specific to dismiss. The courtroom stirred with whispers. The judge frowned, troubled. Sophia's chest tightened, tears blurring her eyes, not of despair this time, but of relief. For the first time since this nightmare began, someone had spoken the truth aloud, and it came from the one she loved most in the world. Anna rose at once, her voice firm. She told the judge that James's testimony was vital and must be investigated. The boy had no reason to lie, and his details aligned with the inconsistencies already discovered. The judge nodded gravely, pausing the proceedings and ordering an immediate inquiry into the child's words. Richard stood nearby, torn between shock and shame. For the first time he met Sophia's eyes. What he saw there made him lower his head in guilt. He realized how blind he had been, how much suffering his silence had caused. Eleanor, once the unshakable matriarch, showed her first signs of weakness. She leaned to whisper urgently to Charles Bennet, her lips trembling despite her effort to remain composed. Her confidence had slipped. Reporters scribbled furiously, already preparing headlines about the stunning turn. The Whitmore image, once flawless, was fracturing before their eyes. Sophia clutched James's hand, overwhelmed with gratitude. Anna leaned close and whispered, "This is our chance." Eleanor sat rigid, her body taut, her hands clenched together. For years she had dictated the truth, bending events to her will. Now her own grandson had spoken against her. She could not silence him. The judge announced the trial would be suspended until James's testimony could be examined further. Officers were ordered to search the estate office for the wooden box he described. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs of change. For the first time, Sophia walked out not as a defeated woman, but as someone who still had hope. Anna knew the battle was only beginning, but victory no longer felt impossible. Back at the Whitmore estate, tension thickened. Richard tucked James into bed that night, but sleep did not come easily. Once James's eyes closed, Richard went to Eleanor's office. She sat behind her desk, pretending to read, but she knew why he had come. He closed the door firmly. His voice for once was strong. He demanded the truth. How could James have known about the wooden box unless it was real? Why had his words matched so precisely? Eleanor's eyes glinted, but she sensed her grip slipping. Richard pressed harder, saying he could no longer protect her unless she explained herself. The air turned heavy. Finally, Eleanor rose, her voice calm but bitter. She confessed her reasons. She said Sophia had grown too close to James, filling a role that was not hers. She said even Richard had begun to look at her differently, as if she were replacing his late wife. Eleanor's tone sharpened. She admitted she had felt threatened. Her plan, she explained, had been only to frighten Sophia, to remind her of her place. But when the pendant vanished, suspicion fell on the maid, and Eleanor let it fester, believing it would preserve the family's legacy. Richard listened in silence, devastated. He realized his mother's fear had blinded them all, and his own silence had made him complicit. He left the office shaken, retreating to James's room. Watching his son sleep, he thought of the courage it had taken for the boy to speak when grown men had stayed quiet. That night, Richard made a choice. He returned to Eleanor's office, this time not to argue but to search. He combed through drawers and shelves until he found a small safe hidden behind a cabinet. With a key from Eleanor's desk, he opened it. Inside lay the missing pendant, wrapped carefully in cloth. Alongside it were envelopes of money, papers, and valuables that did not belong there. Richard stared, heart pounding. This was the proof. The next morning he carried the safe to the police station and surrendered it. Officers recorded the evidence, stunned. Richard explained how he found it, confirming James's testimony. Relief and guilt warred within him. He had done the right thing, but far too late. Sophia had already endured so much. News spread quickly. Headlines shifted overnight. Pendant found in Whitmore safe. Servant innocent? The narrative was changing. The revelation of the safe changed everything. Overnight, the story that had once branded Sophia Miller a thief began to unravel. Newspapers that had condemned her now printed cautious headlines. Innocence emerging? Television anchors who once repeated Eleanor Whitmore's accusations now asked hard questions about her role. For the first time in months, Sophia's name appeared beside the word justice instead of guilt. Inside the courthouse, Anna Carter presented the evidence with determination. She showed the photographs of the pendant recovered from Eleanor's hidden safe, as well as the documents and envelopes found alongside it. Her voice was calm but unshakable as she explained that these discoveries not only confirmed James's testimony, but also proved that Sophia had been framed. The judge allowed Sophia to speak again. This time she rose not in fear but in strength. Her voice was steady as she told her story once more, how she had given years of loyalty to the Whitmores, how she had loved James as her own child, how she had endured humiliation and betrayal for something she did not do. Reporters scribbled feverishly. Cameras captured her face. And unlike before, people now listened. Some members of the audience, once skeptical, lowered their eyes in shame. Sophia's words were no longer brushed aside. Anna pressed forward, laying out the inconsistencies. The camera switched off at the exact moment of the theft. Witnesses who had changed their stories. Eleanor's suspicious influence. Piece by piece, she constructed a narrative that revealed not a servant's betrayal, but a family matriarch's manipulation. Richard stood to confirm his role. His words were heavy, carrying the weight of his silence. He admitted he had trusted his mother blindly, that his obedience had allowed injustice to flourish. He said he had failed Sophia, and he wanted the record to reflect that. His honesty startled the room. Murmurs rippled across the benches. Eleanor sat stiff in the front row, her lips pressed into a thin line. She avoided looking at anyone, especially her son and grandson. For decades she had commanded the truth, but now she sat powerless as the truth turned against her. The judge leaned forward, her voice firm. She declared that the entire process had been flawed from the beginning. Sophia should never have been placed under suspicion without true evidence. She announced Sophia's immediate release. Gasps filled the courtroom, followed by applause from some of those present. Sophia stood stunned. The words washed over her like sunlight breaking through dark clouds. James tore free from Mrs. Green's grasp and sprinted across the aisle. He leapt into Sophia's arms, hugging her fiercely. His voice rang out in the hushed courtroom. "You're my heart, Mommy!" The words struck every soul in the room. Some wept openly. Others clapped softly, moved by the child's love. Cameras flashed, searing the moment into history. Sophia held James, her tears falling freely. She whispered that she would never leave him, no matter what the world had said. That embrace meant more than any legal declaration. It was proof she still carried his love and trust. Journalists rushed to capture the scene. Within minutes the image was everywhere. Sophia, once disgraced, now embraced by the child who had saved her. For the public, it was a symbol of resilience and truth. Outside, the media frenzy exploded. Commentators who once called her greedy now spoke of her dignity. Online articles praised her courage. Comment sections filled with apologies from strangers who admitted they had judged too quickly. For Sophia, the noise of the world did not matter. She did not want fame. She wanted her name restored, her dignity intact. She told Anna she had no intention of suing the Whitmores or demanding money. She only wanted to walk through the streets without whispers, to live quietly without shame. Anna admired her deeply. Many would have sought revenge, but Sophia's heart longed only for peace. Richard stepped forward to address the press gathered outside. His voice shook as he admitted his failure. He said he had believed his mother without proof, that he had let her influence silence him, and that his silence had hurt an innocent woman. He apologized not as strategy, but as a man humbled by truth. Reporters pressed him with difficult questions, but Richard did not retreat. Sophia listened silently. She did not rush to forgive, but her eyes softened. His honesty mattered. James stood at his father's side, smiling for the first time in weeks. The relief on his face was unmistakable. For months he had carried the weight of secrecy. Now he could finally breathe. Father and son stood together, no longer divided by silence, but united in truth. Sophia, watching them, felt grateful for James's courage and for Richard's change of heart. It did not erase her pain, but it marked the beginning of healing. Eleanor, however, could not escape consequences. The judge announced she would face new hearings. The jewel hidden in her safe, the manipulation of witnesses, the attempt to destroy Sophia, all were matters that demanded further judgment. Eleanor said nothing as she was escorted out, her face pale, her posture sagging. Reporters shouted her name, demanding answers, but she remained silent. The woman who once controlled every narrative now had none. Sophia watched her go, not with hatred, but with a sense of closure. She did not wish to hurt Eleanor further. She wanted only to be left alone, to rebuild, to give James the security he deserved. That evening, Sophia walked out of the courthouse free, holding James's hand tightly. Justice had begun to mend what had been broken, and she could see a new chapter waiting. When court reconvened, Eleanor made a final attempt to reclaim control. She lifted her chin, her voice sharp, insisting everything against her was lies. She claimed James was confused, Richard was emotional, and Sophia was manipulative. For a moment the room hushed, but then Anna rose with documents in hand, testimonies from staff who had left the estate. With Eleanor's power waning, they finally dared to speak. One confessed that Eleanor pressured her to lie during the hearings. Another revealed years of intimidation and threats. Their stories painted a pattern of control and cruelty. Gasps filled the courtroom. The prosecutor, who once championed Eleanor's cause, changed his tone. He asked for criminal charges against her, perjury, defamation, obstruction of justice. The judge agreed. The truth could no longer be hidden. Eleanor sat silent. Her once unshakable figure diminished. Sophia listened, tears rising, not of sorrow this time, but of relief. At last, the truth was being named aloud. The judge cleared Sophia officially of all charges. Her innocence was declared in firm words that echoed through the room. Reporters rushed to broadcast the news. Headlines blazed across the nation. Sophia Miller innocent. Justice at last. For months she had been shamed, mocked, and condemned. Now the truth shone for all to see. As she left the courthouse, James at her side, people clapped. Some even approached to apologize. Sophia felt the weight of suspicion lift. She could breathe again. Her life had been shattered, but her name was clean. That was all she had ever wanted. Not revenge, only truth. The days that followed the verdict brought changes Sophia could scarcely have imagined. Her name, once stained by accusation, now appeared in headlines celebrating her innocence. Letters arrived from families offering her work, generous salaries, comfortable rooms, the promise of stability. Yet Sophia politely declined each offer. She told Anna that she needed rest, time to heal, and space to decide her future. She had lived too long under suspicion, too long in the shadow of other people's power. Now she wanted peace. She dreamed of simple things, quiet mornings, walking freely through the streets without fear of whispers, evenings spent with James's laughter in her ears. Anna supported her, admiring her humility. For Sophia, the victory was never about punishment. It was about reclaiming dignity. Meanwhile, Anna's role in the trial did not go unnoticed. Judges, lawyers, even journalists praised her determination. They called her a rising star, a young woman who had faced a powerful family and won. Law firms extended offers, but Anna stayed humble. She reminded everyone this was not her story, but Sophia's. Privately, however, she acknowledged the case had changed her. She had discovered strength she hadn't known she possessed. Seeing Sophia free had been her greatest reward, and she carried that triumph like a flame inside her heart. At the Whitmore estate, the atmosphere shifted drastically. James asked his father if he could spend more time with Sophia. Richard hesitated at first, but then agreed. He had seen Sophia's love for James, and he no longer doubted her intentions. The trial had forced Richard to face truths about himself. He regretted his silence, the blind trust he had given Eleanor. He resolved to rebuild both his values and his bond with his son. Eleanor, meanwhile, found herself isolated. Friends distanced themselves, her influence crumbled, and she faced mounting criminal charges. The woman who once controlled everything now sat in the ruins of her own making. Sophia, Anna, Richard and James left the courthouse that day with their lives forever altered. Lies had nearly destroyed them, but truth had offered a second chance. Weeks later, Eleanor entered the courtroom once again, but this time she stood not as accuser, but as defendant. Evidence piled against her. The pendant found in her own safe. Testimonies from former employees confirming years of intimidation. Financial records revealing hidden transfers. The prosecutor read the charges clearly. False accusation, harassment, obstruction of justice, misappropriation of assets. Eleanor sat rigid. Her proud posture collapsed under the weight of shame. She tried to defend herself, insisting she acted only for her family's good, but her words rang hollow. The judge listened carefully before delivering the verdict. Guilty. Eleanor was sentenced to strict house arrest, heavy financial penalties, and permanent removal from any control over the Whitmore estate. Richard sat in the courtroom, emotions tangled. He had grown up in her shadow, obeying every command. Now he watched his mother stripped of power. He did not feel joy, only a deep sadness, but he knew justice was necessary. When court adjourned, Richard formally stepped into leadership of the Whitmore businesses. Reporters swarmed with questions. How would he restore trust? His answer surprised many. He vowed the family empire would no longer be ruled by arrogance or fear. He promised transparency, fairness, and respect for workers. For Richard, it was more than reputation. It was about repairing the damage caused by years of silence. His first step was to reach out to Sophia, not as an employer, nor as an accuser, but as someone who respected her strength. He confessed that her courage and dignity had inspired him. He told her he wished to start a foundation dedicated to helping women falsely accused, women silenced by power, just as she had been. At first, Sophia hesitated. She did not wish to return to the estate, nor to live under its shadow. But Richard explained she would not be staff. She would lead the foundation herself. She would decide its mission, its rules, its heart. Sophia listened. Slowly a smile formed. This was different. This was not servitude. This was purpose. She agreed. Not out of obligation, but because she believed her suffering could be transformed into something good. Anna celebrated the decision as much as Richard. She watched as Sophia, once humiliated and cast aside, now prepared to step into a position of leadership. At the foundation's announcement, journalists called her a symbol of resilience. Sophia, however, rejected grand titles. She said she was simply a woman who wanted to live honestly. Still, she poured her heart into the mission. Alongside Anna, she began shaping programs to provide legal aid, emotional support, and opportunities for women silenced by power. Richard provided funding, but Sophia set the rules. She was no longer scrubbing floors or standing accused. She was directing meetings, hiring staff, shaping campaigns. For Anna, it was proof that justice did not end in the courtroom. It lived on in voices restored. The foundation became a living symbol that truth could survive wealth and influence. Sophia's name, once dragged through mud, now carried respect. James adjusted quickly to the new chapter. He still spent time with his father, still visited the estate, but his heart belonged with Sophia. He told her once with childlike sincerity, "You're my real mum in my heart." Sophia smiled and told him he would always be part of her life. Richard supported their bond, no longer trying to erase her from James's world. Instead, he encouraged it, understanding his son's happiness depended on her. For James, the two halves of his world finally fit together, the wealth of his father and the warmth of Sophia's care. He knew exactly where love and truth lived. His nightmares faded, his laughter returned, and once again he felt like a child, free to dream. Months passed. Sophia learned to breathe again. She walked the streets without shame, her head high, no longer hiding from curious eyes. She worked hard at the foundation, but also allowed herself moments of rest, filled with James's joy and Anna's friendship. One evening, after a long day of work, she stepped outside to watch the sunset. The sky blazed with colors that reminded her of everything she had survived: the courtroom, the lies, the humiliation, the endless nights of despair. But now she was free. The truth had spoken for itself. Sophia closed her eyes, breathing deeply, letting peace settle in her heart. For the first time in years, she felt whole. What began as an accusation had ended with justice. The sun slipped below the horizon, and Sophia smiled softly. She had found her place again in the world. When the court assembled again, Eleanor Whitmore still tried to hold on to the remnants of her authority. She raised her head proudly, speaking with firm conviction. She insisted that everything against her was false, that James was only a confused child. Richard was weak and emotional, and Sophia was manipulating everyone through sympathy. For a moment the courtroom was quiet. Then Anna Carter rose with a stack of documents in her hand. Calmly, she presented written testimonies from staff who had once worked in the Whitmore estate but had since left. With Eleanor's influence weakened, they were no longer afraid. One maid confessed that Eleanor had pressured her to lie in the first hearings. Another revealed that Eleanor often used threats to keep employees silent. The words fell like stones into the courtroom. Piece by piece, Eleanor's defense cracked. The more she tried to argue, the more desperate her words sounded. Her claims rang hollow compared to the weight of the evidence Anna presented. As testimonies continued, disturbing truths emerged. It was revealed that Eleanor had a history of accusing staff of theft without proof. Years before, a gardener had been dismissed under similar accusations, though nothing was ever proven stolen. Another worker admitted she had been threatened after refusing to help cover up a family embarrassment. Gasps filled the room as the pattern became clear. Eleanor's obsession with control had destroyed lives long before Sophia. The prosecutor, who at the beginning of the case had stood firmly by Eleanor, now shifted his stance. He called for a criminal investigation into her actions, naming perjury, defamation, and obstruction of justice as charges. The judge nodded solemnly. It was no longer a matter of rumor. Eleanor's abuses had been laid bare. Eleanor sat silent, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her proud figure now small under the weight of the truth. Sophia listened, tears rising in her eyes. But these were not tears of pain. They were tears of release. After endless days of humiliation, after so many nights of despair, she was hearing the truth spoken clearly for all to witness. The judge declared her officially innocent. Clearing her name of every charge, the courtroom erupted. Reporters rushed to broadcast the decision. Within minutes, screens across the country flashed headlines: Sophia Miller, innocent. Justice done. For months she had been vilified as a thief. Now the nation saw her as the victim of lies and cruelty. Sophia held James's hand tightly as she left the courtroom, no longer ashamed. People clapped as she passed. Some even approached to apologize for having believed the worst. She felt the weight she had carried for months lift from her shoulders. Her life had been broken apart, but her name was whole again. That was all she had ever wanted. Not vengeance, but truth. In the days after the verdict, Sophia found herself the focus of unexpected attention. Families wrote to her, offering positions, wealth, comfort. But Sophia declined them all. She told Anna she did not wish to enter another household as a servant. She wanted time to decide her own path. Anna understood. Sophia's victory was not about returning to service, but about reclaiming her dignity. Meanwhile, Anna herself was being celebrated. The media praised her courage, calling her a rising star of justice. Firms sought her out, offering positions, but Anna remained modest. She said the case was not about her, but about standing for someone who had been silenced. Still, when Sophia embraced her and thanked her with tears, Anna allowed herself to feel pride. She had made a difference, and that was why she had chosen to practice law. The Whitmore family faced a different reality. James, free of fear, asked to spend more time with Sophia. Richard agreed, recognizing that his son's joy depended on her. For Richard, the trial was a mirror. It forced him to see how his silence had harmed, how blind trust in his mother had cost an innocent woman her peace. He vowed to rebuild, to raise James in honesty rather than pride. Eleanor, by contrast, stood alone. Friends abandoned her. Her influence dissolved. The criminal charges against her mounted. The woman who had ruled with intimidation now sat stripped of her throne. Sophia, Anna, Richard and James left the courthouse one final time, their lives forever changed. Lies had nearly destroyed them. Truth had given them another chance. Eleanor soon stood trial again, but now as defendant. The evidence was damning. The pendant discovered in her safe, the testimonies from staff, the financial records, together they formed a mountain she could not climb. The prosecutor listed the charges clearly. False accusation, harassment, misappropriation of assets. Eleanor sat stiff in her chair, her posture broken by shame. She tried to defend herself, saying everything she had done was for her family. But no one believed her. Her words carried no strength. The judge delivered the verdict. Guilty. The sentence was strict but just. Eleanor would serve house arrest, pay heavy financial penalties, and forever lose control of the Whitmore fortune. Richard watched with sorrow. He had once believed his mother's word unquestionable. Now he saw the ruin her pride had brought. He did not celebrate. He simply accepted the necessity of justice. With Eleanor removed, Richard officially assumed leadership of the Whitmore empire. Reporters asked what his vision would be. He said the Whitmores would no longer rule by arrogance or fear. He promised transparency, fairness and respect. For him, it was more than image. It was a vow to rebuild what silence had destroyed. He began by reaching out to Sophia, not as accuser, not as employer, but as a man who respected her strength. He admitted that her courage had inspired him and that her suffering had opened his eyes. He proposed creating a foundation dedicated to helping women who had been falsely accused, to give them the support Sophia had once lacked. At first, Sophia hesitated. She had no desire to return to the estate. But Richard explained that she would not serve, she would lead. She would be director of the foundation, free to shape its mission. Sophia listened, her eyes widening. Slowly she agreed. Not from duty, but from conviction. Her pain would not be wasted. It would be turned into something meaningful. Anna rejoiced at her decision. Watching Sophia rise from servant to leader filled her with hope. At the foundation's launch, journalists called Sophia a symbol of strength. She smiled humbly, reminding them she was simply a woman who wanted to live honestly. Still, she threw herself into the work. With Anna by her side, she built programs to provide legal aid and support for women silenced by power. Richard provided the funds, but Sophia set the vision, no longer scrubbing floors, no longer standing accused. She was leading meetings, hiring staff, creating change. The foundation stood as proof that truth could survive against wealth and power. Sophia's name now carried respect, not suspicion. James adapted beautifully. He split his time between his father and Sophia, but his heart always leaned toward her. One afternoon he whispered, "You're my real mother in my heart." Sophia hugged him close and promised he would always have her love. Richard supported their bond, knowing his son's happiness depended on it. For James, the world finally made sense again, the luxury of the Whitmores, the warmth of Sophia. He knew where truth lived. His nightmares faded. His laughter returned, and Sophia, watching him smile, knew they had both been restored. As the months unfolded, Sophia Miller settled into her new life. The fear that had once clung to her with every step was gone. She walked the streets of the small town with her head high, no longer avoiding people's eyes. Whispers no longer followed her. Instead, nods of respect and quiet smiles greeted her. At the foundation, she worked tirelessly. There were meetings to attend, staff to guide, campaigns to plan. She poured herself into helping women who faced the same silence she once endured. But she also allowed herself moments of peace, afternoons with James, evenings sharing tea with Anna, mornings when she simply breathed freely without shame. One evening, after a long day, Sophia stepped outside to watch the sun sink low. The sky burned in shades of gold and crimson, colors that reminded her of the journey she had survived. The courtroom, the humiliation, the nights when she thought she could not go on. Now she was free. She closed her eyes, inhaling the warm air, and let the peace seep into her bones. For the first time in years, her heart was calm. The story that had begun with accusation had ended with justice. Eleanor Whitmore, meanwhile, faced the collapse of everything she had built her life upon. Her name, once spoken with reverence, was now whispered with disdain. Invitations to society events stopped coming. Former allies avoided her gaze. Her influence, carefully nurtured for decades, had evaporated overnight. She remained confined under house arrest, watched by officers who ensured her sentence was carried out. The mansion she once ruled as queen now felt like a prison. Her wealth could no longer buy her obedience or silence. The staff who remained served only out of duty, not respect. News outlets that once echoed her words now chronicled her fall. Stories of past accusations against staff surfaced, each one fitting into the larger pattern of her cruelty. She could not escape the narrative she had written for herself. Richard rarely visited her. Their conversations, when they occurred, were brief and strained. For the first time, he no longer bowed to her authority. He spoke with the voice of a man who had seen the truth and chosen a different path. James visited less and less. When he did, he remained quiet, polite but distant. The bond Eleanor once tried to control had been broken. Sophia never spoke ill of Eleanor. She did not rejoice in her downfall. She carried no desire for vengeance. What she wanted was already hers, her freedom, her dignity, and James's love. The foundation grew quickly. Anna Carter proved an invaluable partner. She worked late into the night with Sophia, drafting proposals, reaching out to supporters, and creating programs for women who had been falsely accused. Together they built something larger than either of them could have imagined. Reporters began to call Sophia a symbol, a face of resilience. She brushed away such titles, insisting she was only a woman who had endured hardship and survived. Still, the story spread, inspiring others. Letters arrived from women across the country, thanking her for giving them hope. Richard fulfilled his promises as well. He restructured the Whitmore businesses, introducing new policies of fairness and transparency. For the first time in generations, workers felt their voices mattered. The empire no longer operated on fear but on trust. It was a quiet revolution, born out of the wreckage of pride. For Sophia, the greatest reward was not recognition, but the laughter of James. He thrived once more, free of nightmares. At bedtime he returned to his drawings, sketching pictures of himself with Sophia, always hand in hand. Richard watched this bond with both humility and gratitude. He knew his son's happiness rested on the love Sophia gave. He no longer resisted it. He embraced it. Eleanor's absence became less of a wound and more of a release. The house felt lighter, freer, no longer under her shadow. Months passed. Sophia worked, healed, and loved. She built friendships with staff at the foundation, leaned on Anna's companionship, and savoured James's joy. Her days were no longer filled with tears or fear. They were filled with purpose. One afternoon, Anna found Sophia sitting quietly by the window of her modest home, watching James play outside. "You look peaceful," Anna said softly. "I am," Sophia replied. "For the first time in my life I am." She thought of the long path that had brought her here. The false accusations, the long nights, the betrayal of those she trusted, the humiliation of being branded a thief, and she thought of the courage of a child who had dared to speak when adults remained silent. The truth had not come easily. It had been clawed out of darkness by persistence, sacrifice, and love, but in the end it had triumphed. That evening, Sophia stepped outside again to watch the sunset. The colours stretched across the horizon like a promise. She smiled softly, whispering a quiet prayer of gratitude. Her story had begun with tears, but it had ended with freedom. The world would remember her as the maid accused by a billionaire, but she knew herself as something more, a woman who had stood against injustice and refused to break. She did not need the titles, the headlines, or the praise. She only needed the simple truth that she had survived with dignity and tact. James came running up, holding a flower he had picked. He placed it in her hand, smiling. "For you, Mommy." Sophia bent down, hugged him tightly, and felt tears of joy rise. For her, this moment, this ordinary gift from a child, meant more than any courtroom victory. The sun sank lower, painting the world in fading gold. Sophia stood with James beside her, holding the flower, and breathed deeply. Justice had spoken, and she was free. The courtroom felt different when Eleanor Whitmore sat at the defendant's table. The woman who once commanded fear now looked small, her face pale beneath the harsh lights. The prosecutor spoke plainly: false accusation, harassment, obstruction of justice, misappropriation of family assets. Evidence piled up. The pendant, discovered in her private safe, financial documents hidden for years, testimonies from former staff. Each piece struck like a hammer. Eleanor tried to defend herself. She claimed everything had been done for her family's good, that she had only acted to protect them. But her voice carried desperation, not conviction. Once, her words bent others to her will. Now they fell lifeless in the air. The judge listened without pity. When the verdict was spoken, guilty, Eleanor's proud posture broke. Her sentence: strict house arrest, heavy fines, and removal from control of the Whitmore estate. Richard sat silently. His heart was torn, sorrow for his mother's ruin, but relief that justice had finally come. When reporters asked how he would lead the Whitmore empire, his answer surprised them. He vowed never again to rule through fear or silence. He promised fairness and transparency. For him, it was not about saving reputation. It was about redemption. Richard's first act was to reach out to Sophia Miller, no longer as an employer, not as an accuser, but as a man who respected her strength. He confessed her courage had changed him. He proposed creating a foundation to help women wrongfully accused, so no one else would suffer what she had endured. At first, Sophia hesitated. She had no wish to tie her life back to the Whitmores. But when Richard explained she would lead, not serve, her heart softened. She agreed, not for him, but because her suffering could be turned into purpose. Anna Carter celebrated the decision, proud to see Sophia step into leadership. The foundation's launch made headlines. Reporters called Sophia a symbol of dignity, but she rejected the title. She told them she was simply a woman who survived injustice. Still, her work spoke louder than her humility. She built programs offering legal aid and counseling, guiding others with compassion. Richard provided resources, but Sophia's voice shaped the mission. James thrived in this new chapter. He told Sophia one night, "You're my real mom in my heart." Tears filled her eyes as she hugged him close. Richard respected their bond, finally understanding where his son's happiness truly lived. Eleanor, meanwhile, sat in isolation. Former staff revealed years of false accusations and intimidation. The truth, long hidden, had risen at last. For Sophia, it was enough. She no longer carried shame. Her name had been restored. Eleanor's final hearings revealed even more. Former workers described threats, false accusations, and lives ruined by her obsession with control. The pattern was undeniable. The judge declared Sophia Miller fully innocent, her name cleared forever. Across the nation, headlines shifted. For months, she had been branded a thief. Now she was celebrated as proof that truth could survive power. As Sophia left the courthouse, people applauded. Some even stopped her in the street to apologize. She felt lighter, free at last. Her only desire was simple, to live quietly, without shame. Job offers poured in from wealthy families, but she declined them all. She told Anna she no longer wanted to serve anyone. What she wanted was peace, and the freedom to choose her own path. The foundation grew quickly under her guidance. With Anna's support, Sophia built programs that offered legal defense and support for women silenced by influence. Richard funded it, but Sophia's hand shaped every decision. She was no longer cleaning floors, she was leading change. Reporters still called her a symbol, but Sophia brushed it aside. She didn't need titles. What mattered was helping others find their voices again. James blossomed in this new life. His laughter returned, his nightmares faded. Between his father's world and Sophia's care, he felt whole again. He told her often, "You'll always be my heart, Mommy." She promised him she would never leave. Richard kept his vow, reshaping the Whitmore empire into something honest. He lived with regret for his silence, but also with hope that he could build something better for James's future. Eleanor remained confined, her influence gone. The woman who once dictated truth to everyone now had none. She lived in silence, watched over by guards, her legacy broken. For Sophia, the story had finally closed. She had been humiliated, branded, silenced, but she had not been defeated. Truth had triumphed. One evening, she stood outside watching the sunset. The sky glowed with gold and crimson, just as it had on the hardest nights of her trial. She thought of all she had endured, and the child who had been brave enough to speak when no one else would. She smiled softly. The darkness was behind her. Justice had spoken, and she was free.